Thank you all for coming. It really is a pleasure to see such wonderful, friendly faces.
Yes, I mean, and when I met you, I said, okay, we can be friends. I mean, it was just such a delightful time that we spent together. So let's start out with where you were born and a little bit about your mom and dad.
I was born in the Bronx, in an apartment house, of course, and then I got very sick. And my mother and father decided that if I moved to the country, I would never get sick again. Well, I moved to the country and I've been very healthy, except for a few little things, but otherwise everything, they were right. And growing up in Port Washington, Long Island was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And I really enjoyed it.
Tell us a little bit about your mom.
Well, my mom was an orphan at the age of 12. Her father died. First her mother died, then in the flu epidemic, then her father died. And she went to live with relatives. Well, you know, you hear the story of the poor orphan who was the neglected person. She was like that. And so she vowed that when she had children, she would be the most devoted, loving mother, and she was. To neglect the orphan of herself, we children came first. My son, who's not here, who's wonderful too, and my daughter. And we enjoyed being with my mom a lot.
So what about your dad? What did he do?
My dad was 11 years older than my mother. And he absolutely worshipped her. I have to tell you something, I'm very lucky that I had a very loving husband, but my father was very much worshiped my mother. And he was a cutter of baby hats. And I don't know if you know anything about that industry, but there's age ranges. And so up until 18 months was his age range that he made baby hats, cut fabric, and they made baby hats. And then eventually in Port Washington, where we grew up, they bought property and built a factory and opened up a business, which was fairly successful for a while. And then as time goes, things not so. And the people who worked for my father were the local residents, mostly Italians and Polish. I lived in a very multi-ethnic community, significant number of Italians. And in fact, the community I grew up in the area was mostly Italians, Polish. We had a Polish American hall. And we also had a significant population of Black residents who had a particular wonderful vibe in my life. So I'm really a very lucky person that I grew up in a very multicultural world. And I consider that to be a benefit in my life.
You know, Carol, you shared that your dad allowed them to work at home.
Oh, yes.
Which is very forward thinking.
Right. My father knew that these people needed money. And he needed more workers, and they didn't want to work full time because they had families. I mean, it come dinner time, they needed to go home. So they had a station wagon, and they were loaded up with big boxes of unfinished houses, hats, which they had to have the threads cut and clipped. It had to be perfect because J.C. Penney was one of his companies, and if you brought a group of boxes of hats for them, and there was one thread on it, they would return the whole box.
Oh, wow.
They're very, very picky. So these women worked at home. When it got dark, he'd bring the boxes to their houses. They and their children would work as a family and made lots of extra money, which was good for them. And they became family. I went to many of their weddings, their social events, and we became a very, very wonderful family all over the community.
You know, you shared a cute story about your family dog, she.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Penny. Penny's name is a Hebrew name because when I was away at camp, being a counselor at a Hebrew camp, I fell in love with this guy who didn't know I existed because he was already married. He was well, whatever, but he was wonderful. And then I got a dog and I named it after him. Penny found a girlfriend in town about 1.5 miles away. And every year at a particular time, he would take off and go visit his girlfriend. And they would call, your dog is here, we'll send him home soon. And then he would come home. This happened once a year. True story.
I thought that was so cute. The dog would go to the same house every single year. Okay, so let's talk about school.
Okay.
Elementary school.
I grew up in the town called Port Washington, New York. It was a very well known for its excellent education. And one of the reasons that it became a very popular town to live in was because it had such good education. So in elementary school, we had all kinds of programs, art and PE and music. There wasn't a thing we didn't have, including my kindergarten, which I didn't tell you about that. The kindergarten room was off to the side of the building, and there was a whole big patio, enclosed patio. And every time you had a birthday, you'd have a birthday out there on the patio.
Oh, wow.
It was wonderful. I mean, I was very lucky to grow up in that town. Do you feel that way, Susan?
Sure.
Yeah.
They grew up there till they were teenagers, then they came to California.
So did you start playing sports in elementary
In
school?
elementary school, we had a coach who encouraged us, and we had all kinds of sports. When I got to junior high school, the number of sports I was able to play enlarged. But when I got to high school is when I really played a lot of different sports, particularly field hockey, which was my favorite, and baseball and basketball and all the other things. And we had a PE teacher who believed in women's living and women's rights. And so she fought for us to have a bus that took us to intramurals at different schools. We had a full program of athletics in that school, and that was unusual. But many of the schools on Long Island were like that, very forward thinking as far as girls' sports and so forth. And again, my favorite sport was field hockey, and the second one was basketball.
And you know, I don't know if you remember when we talked, but I played field hockey too in high school. And I never met anyone else who played field hockey until
Right,
I spoke to Carol. What position did you play?
fullback.
Okay, I was a guard, like the very end. But I loved it as well.
Yes, a wonderful sport.
Yeah. You shared, this is a cute story, and you know, your whole life was so open to multicultural and just so
Right.
many people. But you also got introduced to an interesting situation when you had a crush on
A young man.
the family babysitter's cousin or something.
We had a school where you could go learn ballroom dancing, believe it or not. And so my mother and father enrolled my sister and me in this particular school. And I met this guy named Charlie Koner, whose aunt, or cousin, became my official babysitter. But anyway, I fell in love with Charlie. Charlie and I would go to the movies for 25 cents in the afternoon in the local movie theater. Never once did we hold hands. Never once did he put his arm around me. I said, well, what kind of disease do I have? Then later on, I found out that Charlie was gay.
Yeah,
So I felt better about being rejected.
but I think that's you know, that opened your world as well,
It did.
right? So his history, you loved history in high school. Did you enjoy that?
Social studies, particularly history. I love history.
A few boyfriends.
Oh, yeah, here and there.
Okay.
Nothing specific, nothing really serious.
Okay, let's talk about you cooking dinner all the time.
Oh, my job was to come home, no matter what I did, was to cook dinner for my father and mother. My mother was working, and I enjoyed cooking, so I would have to be the cook. And I would come home, closer, I would come home and have to cook dinner. Well, I use a pressure cooker. I don't know if anybody ever used a pressure cooker, but it sure did help me make my potatoes and my dinner in a hurry. And it was really fun, and I became a very good cook. I enjoyed it very much.
What did you make? I mean, what were some of the dinners that you made? Do you remember?
Stew, chicken soup, particularly.
Okay, and your parents were thrilled at that.
Oh, yeah. Can you imagine coming home and having dinner ready?
No.
It was, my father was a very easy man to please, and so whatever I made was fine for him too.
Something about your dad, did he play bingo or something, and
They played poker.
something about a roasting pan? I don't know, you
Oh,
shared.
we didn't have a lot of money. And when my father and mother were in business, most of the money, as you know, gets poured back into the business. So one year we decided to take a family vacation. And that time we had one of those fancy station wagons, the wooden ones, if you recall. Most of us could recall that. My daughter doesn't recall that, or my son-in-law. But anyway, so we went on a family vacation, 3-seater. Front seat was for whoever wanted to sit there. Middle seat was for my mother, so she could take a nap all the time. And my sister and I would sit in the back and fight like other kids would do and so forth. So but we had a good time. So we wound up in the country, upstate New York somewhere at a fair. And my father won a roasting pan. We were so excited about winning a roasting pan. It was well, lots of fun. Those were good times.
You did fun family vacation?
Yes, but mostly by car.
Yeah.
My parents didn't have the kind of money that maybe we had with our children and treated them to, or they had on their own. So we really had a good time as a family.
So did you go to college?
Yes, I went to Oswego State Teachers College. Why did I choose Oswego? Because it had an industrial arts program and there were the same amount of women as men. I didn't want to go to a state teachers college which had only women. So I chose that. It was on Lake Oswego. If you've ever been upstate New York, you know how cold it is in the wintertime. It's very, can you hear me now? It's very cold in the wintertime. So cold that you had to wear leggings, believe it or not, as an adult, and winter clothes and so forth. And my room, after I was there for 2 years, I'll get to that later, I left and went somewhere else, NYU, but in that 2 years, we had a fire escape outside my apartment house where I lived. It was a small dorm, and I lived in one of the bedrooms with 5 girls. We had a fire escape outside my window. Well, that's how we would get past curfew. We would go out, check in, come back in, and then go upstairs and sneak back down the.
So when did horseback riding come into your life?
Okay, in high school, my parents were horseback riders, and we had a stable. Well, it turned out to be a few blocks from where I eventually bought a house, but in my community, there was a stable of horses, and the high school had a horseback riding team. And so I learned how to horseback ride, and my parents encouraged it. And then when I went to college, the college bought a stable right near the school within walking distance of the campus. And for 50 cents an hour, you could ride all you wanted. You know, that was really like no money. And the difference is that I learned how to ride English, but the college had Western. So I learned how to be a rodeo rider. I did roping and all kinds of fun things like that. I was very lucky to have all these experiences gathered around for me to choose from.
And you transferred then to NYU?
Then I decided I was not getting a very good education. I had thought about this for a while. It was not the kind of fine arts school that I wanted with English and arts and so forth. And I was thinking of transferring. Well, that summer, I met my husband on a horse. And I said to my husband, my mother and father, I think I met the man I'm going to marry, which was rather unusual because I was not going to get married until I was 25. I wanted to see the world and do my thing. And so they were kind of shocked. But it turned out 60 years later, we were still married. But I met him and I continued to romance with him and we had a good time. And my daughter here and my son are both products of that wonderful relationship.
But your story was cute because you were riding on a horse.
Okay, I was riding on a horse. If you grew up in Long Island, you grew up not from the city, you were kind of like a farm girl, so to speak. You didn't know much about the outside world. Really and truly, it seems strange to say that tonight, but was true. So I got on my horse, I found this place that said $25 and $2.50 tipping and nothing else. You could ride as long as you want, as often as you want. So I said to my mother and father, in those days you asked permission. I was around 19, 20. And I said, you know, what am I gonna ride if I went away for a weekend horseback riding? Who are you gonna go with? I said, well, I'll go with Aunt Elsie. She was going to be my mother's brother's, going to become my new aunt. So she said, okay, I'll have her for a chaperone. You can imagine girls and boys asking for a chaperone. But anyway, so we went there and
I don't know, you were riding a horse and he was there.
I was riding and it was a woods. There were trails all through the woods. So I get on the horse at 7:30 in the morning to ride the whole day. Just come back for lunch and go back out again. Well, I see these 2 guys behind me. And I said to myself, this doesn't feel right. So I stopped my horse on the trail and I looked down and there was my future husband sitting with another woman, just a friend, it turned out to be. And I said, you know, I think I'd like to go back. Can I sit out up here and wait for you when you and your friend are ready to go back? Because I was a little nervous about these guys in the woods. And they said yes, and I followed him again for another 60 years.
I
That's
love
how that happened.
And you got an outstanding scholarship awarded in NYU, yes?
Yeah. Upper 10% of your class, I had a scholarship program. I was very impressed with myself because I didn't think I was that smart.
So tell us about, you lived in Port Washington. Tell us a little bit about that.
I lived in Port Washington all my life, 40 years. I had my 2 children there. We left when my daughter was 14, and my son, we came to California because my husband was transferred. But it was a wonderful, wonderful life growing up in that small town. There were only 100 Jewish families there. So getting to meet Jewish people in that particular environment was difficult. So I joined a youth group that met in Young Judea, that met in Flushing. And I had to get on the Long Island Railroad and ride to Flushing, transfer to a bus and go to this meeting or stay over somebody's house. And that was kind of nice, fun to do too.
Had a very interesting experience with your first job with kindergarten.
Yes,
And a child that,
right.
yeah.
I became a kindergarten teacher in New York State. When you wanted to become a kindergarten teacher, you needed to play the piano. That was the one time I said to my mother, thank you, because she forced me to play the piano. And if I hadn't played, I would not have been able to teach kindergarten. And while teaching kindergarten, you think you become a know-it-all the first time you're teaching. I know this, I know that. And one of our persons here is a child psychologist, right? Down there. And she would know what I'm saying. So I see this child, one of the children, Michael, walking around, talking things up in the sky and all. And I watched him and I said, this is not right. This doesn't seem normal. So I went to see the school psychologist, who said to me, Carol, this is your first job and everybody is going to be having problems and you're identifying everything from the book. Well, it so happened that I hadn't been right. The young man was schizophrenic and almost wound up in an institution. Needless to say, the parents were furious with me. I mean, they never forgave me for all the years that I taught in that school. But then later on in adult life, I happened to meet them and they thanked me for saving their child's life, which was very meaningful to me. And I began to have a few children in my classroom who were special needs children. And I really enjoyed working with them and I was somewhat successful. So that became my career. I became a special educator, starting in kindergarten and winding up in high school.
Yeah, that's amazing.
I loved high school. They were wonderful kids. And my high school job was in an all-Black community. The students were 99% Black. I never had such a good time teaching anybody, never had such an easy time teaching anybody as this particular classroom. They were just wonderful. And so I enjoyed that very much.
I don't know, there's something about show and tell and a boy dog.
Oh, Penny, the dog that I had. My husband and I were married about a few months, and I had show and tell. More people know what show and tell is with kindergarten kids especially. So one of the children brought their dog, a little white puppy, so cute. I said, do you have any more like that? He said, yes. So the next day, Idget came. Idget is a part of Idiot, and that was my husband's name for him. And we had 2 bathrooms in my kindergarten classroom. So what do I do when the dog put paper down in the girls' bathroom? Boys and girls could not understand why I put a boy dog in the girls' bathroom. I mean, that's really true. They used to say, Mrs. Lewis, you shouldn't do that. They were cute.
And you had to leave teaching. I experienced that too. As soon as you're pregnant, you had to leave.
Right. Well, I went to school back in September, pregnant. I didn't tell my boss. I had my obstetrician lie for me. And then about a month later, I told her I was pregnant. Then at the end of 4.5 months, I had to leave. I have to tell you something, that 4.5 months till my daughter, my first child, was born was wonderful. I had freedom. I ran around the city. I had a good time. I had a lovely time. And I was pleased that I was forced to take the time off because I had been working since I was about 12.
I don't know if any of you are school teachers, but that was the case in those years. We had to stop. I had the same experience when I was pregnant. And the minute you start to show, you had to resign.
Yeah, you might have to tell them the truth.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so Susan was born and you have another child as well?
I have a son, David, who was born 2.5 years later. David lives in California with his family, and he just became a grandfather, and I became a great grandmother.
Oh,
Yeah.
congratulations.
How old is she now? About 7 months now.
Wow. So a little bit about your husband, worked for the veterans.
My husband studied PE in high school, in college. Never graduated with a PE degree, but never really wanted to do that. Unfortunately for my husband, he didn't have the kind of guidance that we have today with our children and so forth. And so he became a physical therapist and worked in physical therapy for the government, the United States government, the VA. And he worked with the physically disabled, and he was particularly involved with the Vietnam veterans. That was his job. And so, I don't know if you know about the field of prosthetics. We use artificial limbs to replace limbs that have been lost in the war, and he was in charge of that program nationwide. And fortunately for me, he had to travel to go visit all these places. So I went and traveled with him and left my 2 children with a wonderful babysitter and said, bye, Mom's going on that trip with Daddy. That was pretty brazen in those days.
Absolutely. So he
And
retired.
he retired from that with many honors. And one of the things I'll share with you, come Halloween time, we used to have these artificial hands and arms. We used to open the trunk of the car, close the trunk, and have them sticking out in the trunk. It was funny. And my daughter just couldn't stand the fact that she used to see these eyes.
You remember that, Susan? Nightmares.
No, I actually like the eye.
You like the eyes?
So Earl retired at 60?
It was forced to retire because he was moved to California. A few years later, they decided to move us back to New York. Well, I don't know about you or Washington DC, but we couldn't afford it anymore. Prices had gone so sky high. So because he was forced to retire, he could retire early. He retired at 55, which is much too young to retire. Yes, sir, Susan, he was 55.
Wow.
And he retired, and we spent several years by himself, a kept man, because I worked to continue. And I used to rub it into him, you're a kept man, don't forget that. But then he retired too, and we spent the rest of our lives together traveling all over the world. And I'm very lucky to have traveled to all the continents of this earth. That was one of my goals. And my best trip was to Africa. That was wonderful. Yeah, that was exciting. And we used to take the children on ski trips all the time. As a school teacher, when my husband came home one day from visiting my sister, and he says, Carol, we're going to start skiing as a family. I said, what? We can't afford that. You'd have to go from Long Island to someplace else and ski. He said, don't worry about it. And I didn't. And we managed, and we all became a skiing family. So every year we would take a Christmas vacation. Instead of going to the Caribbean, we go skiing.
Wow. But you also shared that you did you do publicity for a psychologist?
Yes, I met a psychologist, and he was branching out, and he needed someone to work for him doing publicity. And I said, okay, I'll try. I had done a lot of volunteer work that way, and I tried it, but I don't like it. I really just like teaching. I never wanted to become a principal. I never wanted to become an administrator. I only wanted to be a classroom teacher, and that's what made me happy. So that's what I did.
Yeah. That happens so often, right? When you do well, they want to promote you, and then they take you out of what you really, really love doing.
Fortunately, I had many opportunities to do many things for LA Unified School District in positions of advisors and so forth. But each time I never became a principal. I never became an administrator. I don't want that.
Right. Yeah. And I know sadly that that Earl passed away in 2000.
My husband unfortunately had ALS. Now, I don't know whether you know anything about ALS, but when you work as a physical therapist, you get to see a lot of disabled illnesses. And that was one of his biggest fears, was becoming physically disabled and having spent his life working with them. And unfortunately, we didn't know about his disease until a few months before he died. So that was really lucky for him, that he didn't have to live with that over his head.
Absolutely. And then you moved to Atlanta.
Pardon me?
Soon after that, you moved to.
Okay, I lived myself for 6 years in my beautiful home, in my lovely little community that I had made so many friends and had done so much charitable work and things. But I decided, what if I got really sick? There's nobody here. My son's in California, my daughter's here. So I decided to move with my daughter. And that was the best decision I've made in a long time. And it was very nice. I came here visiting many, many times. So Atlanta was not unfamiliar to me. I liked it. I liked the fact that it had so many trees and greenery and so much beautiful homes. And it was a lovely area and I liked living, visiting. So I decided to try it. So I stayed here for a month in one of the guest suites. And I went traveling all around Atlanta, fancy places. And I said, no, that's not for me. That's not the person I am. I wanted a homey, friendly place. And here I am, 3 years later, and never regret a moment. This is the most wonderful place to be with all of you wonderful people who've shown up in my support. Thank you.
Carol, this has been so much fun. You shared so much of your life. And we thank you, but before we end, does anyone have any questions for Carol?
I would like to talk to you about Judaism. I didn't mention that to you. Considering that there were only 5 Jewish children my age, and there wasn't one guy that it was interesting in, they were awful. So I never bothered to date anything. We just became friends. And then when I moved here, and I found the Friday night services that they have here among the people who, most of you who are here have come from that. I have to tell you, I found another home. And I was growing up in a Jewish environment, very important to me and to my family. And I'm pleased that I found this place that has it.
Being that I know Huncliffe for like 17 years, one of the things that I love is that you can go to Bible study and not necessarily be Christian. You can go to services Friday night and not necessarily be Jewish. That everyone is here just enjoying life and participating in whatever Huncliffe has to offer. So I walk away sometimes, Carol, feeling like this is just one big, wonderful community. And I see it over the years that if someone loses, their spouse, the support is incredible. And I see that, looking in, and I it's not a joke. I say to Ellen, when we moved to Huncliffe, I want my dad's apartment. I have to make sure that apartment is available for us. So thank you.
I also want to share with you about dinner tonight.
Oh,
I think my children got to know how friendly and warm everybody is. They feel welcome and comfortable, and they don't come every day. So it really was nice to see that welcoming.
yeah, and I would encourage you to, I don't always say this, but there are so many residents who don't come out of their apartment. Maybe they're unable to, but some can, and they don't. And I always encourage you to invite them to activities and get them out, because once you come out and socialize, life becomes great. And it's wonderful. And you certainly have dived in, and that's been an example for everyone. So thank you.
It's easy to dive in when you're welcome, because everybody makes you feel right.
Any questions for Carol? Well, then we'll say,
But as the mother of special needs young man,
Yeah. Yeah, for what you've done. That's so true. You have to have that person that just says, wait a minute, there's something going on here and I need to.
Well, I should share with you that there was another kindergarten teacher. Donnie Rothenberg was in her class. How you never forget a name. This goes back to 1969. And one day, the school psychologist comes to see me, she says, Carol, I have a student I want you to take. I said, okay, fine, not a problem. Johnny Rothenberg wet his pants every single day, several times a day. And she couldn't handle the fact that he was wet like that. So she said, can you take it? I said, sure, no big deal. I didn't even have any children then, so what did I know about changing clothes and so forth? But it was not a problem. And within a week or so, he was no longer wetting his pants, which gave me the clue that I had found my niche. All I did was go over to him like this and say, Johnny, and he knew to go to the bathroom. And if he, after a while, it wasn't so often, then after a while, he was dry. And it just meant having respect for someone,
Right.
even though they were disabled. That was my introduction to disabilities.
Well, you must have that sense that you could just observe that.
Yeah, you're right, you do
You
have,
have to have that.
but most teachers are like that.
That's true, yeah. Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you for listening.